Happy New Year, everyone. It's been an interesting year for the games industry. Obviously, it's been one of the most substantial years for game releases in potentially my entire lifetime. I mean, we're talking about like Baldur's Gate 3, Diablo 4, Spider-Man 2, Jedi Survivor, Lies of P, Starfield, more games, Alan Wake 2, Resident Evil 4 remake, other games that were at the Game Awards for Game of the Year that are totally blanking from my head right now. But regardless, it's been a ridiculous year for games releases. But that's been coupled with a historic year for game industry layoffs, which is not ideal and demonstrates some core issues with the ways that games are being made right now, in my opinion. There's a couple issues that lead to mass layoffs, one of which is just pure old-fashioned greed on the part of industry executives who are like not willing to cut down on the amount of money they make, so they just fire all the people that they could afford to pay if they didn't take such a heavy profit share, but, you know, whatever. The second thing is, it's just a fundamental problem with the way games are made, and that making games right now is way too expensive. There was a massive leak from the company that makes the Spider-Man games that came out, and amongst other things, which are bad, and it's obvious that I'm not condoning any kind of leaks or whatever, but I think an important bit of information that came out of that is that Spider-Man 2, one of the biggest games of the year, nominated for Game of the Year, didn't make a profit. And that's really bad. If a game that successful is not making a profit, that underlines some much more significant problems in the industry right now with how these things are being produced. We need to figure that out. And also, we desperately need a game dev union. So, with that in mind, and considering that I'm not anti-AAA industry on principle, most of my favourite games this year were AAA games. My game of the year was Star Wars Jedi Survivor, closely followed by Lies of P. So, I don't think we can fully condemn it, but I think it's always good to promote the alternative. And I think having a healthy indie industry can only be helpful to the games industry as a whole. So with that in mind, welcome back to Kyle's annual Indie Game Recap. As per usual, these aren't all games that technically came out in 2023, but hey, just because a game didn't come out this year doesn't mean the devs no longer care about it, and they won't make any more money if you spend money on it. So, you know, it's still worth playing games that are a few years old, especially in indie where games age a bit differently because they're not aiming for realism. It's also a bit different because, unlike last year, I have actually made videos already on a couple of these, so my coverage on those will probably be a bit later than the others because I can point to it and say, hey, I did a whole video on this one already. Speaking of which, Citizen Sleeper came out last year, but it's as relevant this year as it was last year, and it's still friggin' fantastic. One of the best games I played all year. As mentioned, I did a whole video on Citizen Sleeper already, so I don't need to retread all of that. If you want an in-depth look at the game, then you can click on that video. But it is just, if you can't be bothered, it's an RPG. It's in a sort of cyberpunk setting. It's quite light on visuals and quite light on gameplay. It plays almost like a tabletop game, where all of your actions are determined by dice that you roll at the start of the day, and so you've got like 1 to 6, and that'll determine your success, and you basically pick what you want to use these dice for. But it's just intensely well written, it's got a great atmosphere, it's got great music, it's just constantly engaging, and they announced a sequel this year at not E3, whatever. So that's something to look forward to. There's lots of indie games, but there's a couple of like must-play indie games like Disco Elysium, and I honestly would put Citizen Sleeper up on that level. I think it is phenomenal. Let's keep things mixed up here, shall we? So Yoku's Island Express is a pinball adventure game. What does that mean? Well, so you play as a dung beetle, and so along with you, if you know anything about dung beetles, it's that they roll big balls of poo, right? So throughout the game, you play as this beetle and you're always rolling this ball, and it's a 2D platformer game with pinball mechanics because you're always rolling this ball. So eventually, sometimes you'll come to these levels where you have to ping pong about to try and like solve puzzles and things like that. It's a little bit hard to explain, but when you're actually playing it, it's very cohesive and is arguably the best pinball game I've ever played, because pinball is usually, you know, like a 5-minute max game. You play it and then you're like, okay, I get it, I'm bored now, and you move on to something else. But actually using those mechanics to actual gameplay is interesting. And just in general, it's a very funny game, very strange in tone, but in a fun way that keeps you engaged. And it's not a complex, deep story or anything, but it's fun and it's engaging and it's worth your time. You play a bug, he's a postman on this magical island, and you've got to stop the apocalypse. You know, normal indie game stuff. Weird West is probably the most serious, artsy game on this list. Not so much artsy. Weird West crosses the line into what we typically call like AA studio-wise, where it's somewhere between like a full indie, like 5-man dev team and a proper AAA studio with studio support. It was a studio called, Wolfeye, and it's founded by the former founder of Arcane Studios, so those are the people that made Dishonored and things of that nature. And it is a very, very competent game. It's a top-down, not quite top-down, that sort of like 2.5D perspective game. Set in the Weird West, which is, it's more of a genre than an actual setting, but Weird West basically means it's the Wild West with spooky magical elements in it. The story itself is fine. I won't get into too many spoilers, but basically instead of having a set protagonist, the game switches between 5 protagonists, 1 for each chapter of the game, and kind of uses that framing to show different aspects of this setting. So the first one is a bounty hunter, and she is like a normal person, so the weirdness stays weird to her. But then the second protagonist is a mutant pigman, so he is much more a part of the weirdness, and that different perspective is cool. But in my opinion, it doesn't fully coalesce into an interesting major story, but that's not too much of a deal breaker, because just the setting and the atmosphere and the game systems of the game are really interesting. One of the core mechanics you can do is a slow-mo action dive, so, you know, pretty cool, because it's not based, you might think from the setting it's got like turn-based combat or something, but no, it's more like it's like a twin-stick shooter, except not so hectic. Definitely selling point to me is the atmosphere. I think the weird music and the visual style and the sound design especially all come together to make a really interesting game world to be in. And I think it is a sign of good things to come from this studio. I think whatever their next game is, which I don't think they've announced yet, is going to be something to watch for. I think it's going to be really interesting. This one is the award winner for the longest game title in this video, and that has to go to Coffee Talk Episode 2, Hibiscus and Butterfly. So I guess I'll use this to also just promote the first Coffee Talk. So Coffee Talk is a very, very simple game. It's in a pixel art style, and you run a coffee shop, and 95% of the game is just listening to people talk. You play as the barista, and people come in, and they just talk about their lives, and you occasionally serve coffee to them. And it's a very, very cozy game. That's the best word for it. It's very cozy. It's not quite so simple as that, though, because you can, in some ways, change the story depending on what you give them as their coffee order. Like, if you get it right, things will go better, or occasionally you can give people something that they didn't ask for but is what they really need, that sort of thing, and it will impact things in that way as well. And that difference is somewhat incorporated into the story, but it's not a huge deal because kind of the idea of these stories, I didn't even mention, it's like a low fantasy setting, so it's set in San Francisco, but there's like elves and demons and stuff there. But the stories aren't like major, it's just these people coming in and kind of talking about their regular life concerns, like relationship problems and career problems and things of that nature. And that might sound boring, but it's a very well written game. All of these characters are very endearing, and it's just it's not a long game. It's like each episode is about 2 hours to complete maximum, I think. But it's just a game that's very warm and very pleasant to play. It's got a great soundtrack, and just the atmosphere comes through. The whole idea is your coffee shop open late at night and the rain's always pouring down, but inside here it's nice and warm, and it's where people talk. I didn't think there would be a sequel, but the sequel is much the same. It follows a couple new characters, but a lot of returning characters. It adds a single new game mechanic, which is a lost and found drawer, but overall it's more of the same. So I'm recommending Coffee Talk 2 in this video, but really I'm recommending both Coffee Talks because you can't really play the second episode without playing the first one. I mean, you could, but it's an episode 2. The first episode establishes the characters, the second episode follows up on the characters. Did you know that a Star Trek game came out this year? Did you know that it has Jonathan Frakes as William Riker in it? No? That's because the marketing for this game has been abysmal. Star Trek Resurgence is a game by Dramatic Labs, which is founded by the same people who worked at Telltale Games before that company went bankrupt. And it's just a Telltale game. Like, it has all of the same gameplay and ideas and dialogue type choices and things like that from a Telltale game. It just doesn't have Telltale written on it. And the Telltale format and Star Trek is just a match made in heaven. It works perfectly. Star Trek Resurgence it's basically a super long playable episode of TNG, and it's excellent. I would recommend it if you're a fan of the Telltale format, but especially if you're a Trekkie. It's without spoiling too much, the entire thing is based on a season 1 episode of TNG. A bad episode of TNG, quite frankly, but they take the nugget of a good idea that was in the episode and expand it into an actual story that is just a classic Star Trek adventure. The game is split between 2 characters, the commander of the ship and a low-level engineer, and that gives you sort of a different perspective on the unfolding adventure from the top-level command in the bridge, and then the low-level engineer who's actually out in the field solving problems, and it's just a very well-considered split between the 2 characters. And as per usual, it has a lot of the Telltale jankiness, where you'll see like textures pop in and out sometimes, and sometimes the subtitles won't match, and sometimes things just look a bit weird. But if you can get around that, which you usually can because of the quality of the writing, then it is well worth your time. Adios is one of those games in that I'm not sure I'd be fully comfortable describing it as a game. It's more like an experience. A short experience at that. I think you can wrap the whole thing up in about an hour to 40 minutes. Visually, it's not winning any awards. Gameplay-wise, it's definitely not winning any awards. But story-wise and voice performance-wise is fantastic. Basically, you play as a farmer who has been disposing of bodies for the mafia, and he's an old man, and he's decided he doesn't want to do it anymore. And the game is just the day that he decides he doesn't want to do it anymore, and the mafia guy who has to come in and say, hey, if you're not going to do this anymore, you know too much and we're going to have to kill you. And that's the game. It's just these two guys talking about this situation, and it is enthralling. It's short. It's very interesting. I don't want to talk about it too much because I've basically already spoiled the whole thing, but just seeing this unfold and trying to navigate this complicated emotional situation is just very enthralling to listen to. Chicory is a game by Greg Lobanov, aka the guy who made Wonder Song, one of my favourite games of all time. Now, Chicory is not as good as Wonder Song, but it's still pretty good. So, I don't know if this is a career theme or whatever, but Wonder Song was all about music, and Chicory is all about colour. The basic game mechanic is you have a magic paintbrush which you control with, I guess it would be your mouse and a PC, or one of the sticks and a controller. And the entire world is a colouring book that you can colour. A lot of the time it's just for fun, you want to colour this part like this or whatever, but it's also cleverly incorporated into a lot of puzzle mechanics and navigation mechanics. Like if you paint a certain plant, then it'll grow and become a platform on a different level, that sort of thing. It's an interesting mechanic, it's used in a lot of interesting ways, but most importantly the game is very classically indie vibe sort of game. It has a lot of the tropes of this kind of indie game, like cutesy characters, very good music, speech bubble dialogue with lots of cute things and little inside jokes and all this. It's all presented very sincerely. There's not like any irony to it. It's just a very classic indie game type of game. And I'm not saying that in a condemnatory way. It's just that it doesn't have that kind of it doesn't have that second layer that Wonder Song had. It's all very, it's very surface level, at least in my opinion. And that doesn't make it bad. It's still a very good game. It's on my list of recommended games. There's plenty of games that I've played this year that are not on this list. So, this is a curated list of games that I think you should play. And yeah, the bard from Wonder Song makes a little cameo. So that's good. And so does someone else on this list. But we're not there yet, and maybe I just won't reveal who. Maquette, or Maquette, or Maquette, I don't know how you pronounce it. It's a French word, I guess. It's another one of those games. It's not really a game. It's more gamey than some of those others, but it's in a genre that I'm going to continue calling interactive poetry because that just makes sense for what this sort of thing is. It's another one of these games that's a little hard to describe. It's on the surface, I guess, a puzzle game with size-changing mechanics. So you can change the size of things based on this map in the center and all that. But the important part is the story that the game tells, which is the start and slow, painful end of a relationship. It's very well voiceovered. I want to say Bryce Dallas Howard plays the girl in it, which is some star power that you don't normally get for a game like this. But it's very well told. It's very personal and very relatable if you've been in that kind of experience. And if you've not, then the game might not land at all. It's one of those games. But it's still an interesting experience, and it's not too long. And it has some very interesting musical choices in it as well. It doesn't have an in-game score. It uses curated music that it's picked from some probably bands that you've never heard of, but it's interesting. It's an interesting score. Apparently we have to have one of these every year. This is Toem, a photo adventure, another one in the growing genre of taking photos of cute things. This one is a bit more gamey than some of the other ones, which really are just walk around this environment, take pictures. There is actually somewhat of a story to it, and there's more reasons to take the pictures. There's quests that you're given and you have to fill in this badge. It's not an overly complicated story, but there is one. And the game has a really nice art style. It's all black and white. So it makes it a little bit more visually distinct. And it does an interesting thing where the game has a top-down perspective, but when you go to take a picture, it switches to first-person perspective, so when you take a picture, it can kind of show you things that you didn't see in the widescreen perspective. It's another one of the games on this list that's, mostly just a cozy game. I like me a cozy game sometimes. Cozy games are nice, they're fun, and they're not too stressful, and really, sometimes that's what you want, especially when you're playing an indie game like this. You're not looking for a high-stress kind of environment. Except for the times when you are, I guess, like the next game on my list. This is Inertial Drift, which is a racing game, unlike a lot of other racing games in which the racing isn't actually the focus. The drifting is the focus. I'm not usually super into racing games, but this one is, it's very vibey, and I do like a vibey racing game. The vibe of this one is that kind of neon street punk drifting, but it's different from a lot of other racing games in that the cars aren't meant to feel like normal racing cars. There's a lot more emphasis put on the mechanics of drifting, and unlike most games with drifting, you just hit a button and you go into a drift. It doesn't work like that at all. You actually have to figure out like the weight of the car and the different mechanics that can actually make a car swing out and how to do a drift and stuff, and I don't really understand the mechanics of that, but the game does a decent job of teaching you it. And it also escalates in difficulty a bunch. You start in a car that's very easy to drift around, and by the third one it's like, this is a brick, and how do you get this brick to drift? But even if you don't get super far into it, it has a really nice art style, it has some good music. It's just a very interesting games. And I wish, like, the standard look for racing games is always realism, and I think there's a lot more interesting stuff you can do in the racing genre other than realistic racing sims, and I think this is a good example of that. Venba is a cooking game. Sort of. It's not like a cooking simulator or anything. You have like a set ingredients and a page. The cooking is more thematic than it is an actual gameplay element, because this is one of those more it's for the story kind of games. Venba is the story of an immigrant family coming from, I think it's India, to Canada, and their life over the next 30 to 40 years. Starting from when they're young to when they have their kids, and to when they're old and retired. And it's just a very real kind of story, kind of navigating what it means to try and like integrate your culture with another culture, and what do you do when your kids kind of reject the culture that they grew up with, and how do you deal with that in a new country with trying to keep your culture alive? And it handles all this through the metaphor of food and cooking and this old recipe book that you brought over. It's another short one. It has a great soundtrack of like Indian pop music, I guess. I don't actually know if it's real. I think they might have made it for the game, but it's very cool and very different to like any other game that I've played, because I don't know, I just don't normally listen to that kind of music, so, and it really helps kind of get you into the spirit of it and understanding what's going on in the game. It's good, it's a short experience, it's another 2 hour or so one, well worth your time. Cocoon is the one that I am obligated to talk about this year. This is the big indie game of the year, because it's made by the guy who made Inside, which is a game that everyone loves except for me. Maybe that'll become a video someday. But regardless, Cocoon, it was nominated for, it was either Indie Game of the Year or Debut Game of the Year, one of those categories. And listen, I didn't love it per se, but I do respect it. I do understand why it's so popular. It's a very competent puzzle game. The core idea is you're another bug carrying around balls. Apparently that's the theme this year, but each ball is like a world into itself, and so you can kind of go into these worlds within other worlds and use that mechanic to solve different puzzles. It sounds a bit complicated to explain, but you quickly wrap your head around it when you're in it. Like Inside, the story is very much like, it will mean whatever you want it to mean. At least in my opinion. I think I haven't really looked into it, but I assume people have lots of different interpretations of what it could mean. It's very, very vague in a way that just doesn't interest me all that much, but I'm sure it will be very meaningful to someone. but purely as a puzzle mechanic and a puzzle game, it is interesting. So I will give it props for that. And yeah, it's probably the only one on this entire list that you don't need me to tell you about, because it's the big one for the year that all the YouTubers are talking about. And finally, let's wrap it up with a friendly, familiar face. It's the Frog Detective. He's the number 2 detective, and he's got a mystery to solve. Again, I made a whole video about Frog Detective already, but if it's a very simple adventure game. Very short. You can get the whole thing done in about an hour and a half. But it's really pleasant to play. It's very funny. It's just a good time. It's just a good, pleasant time where you play as this cute frog and solve very simple mysteries. And that's all there is to it, and I love it for that. So, those were some of the best indie games I played this year. Let me know what you think. Please drop your recommendations in the comments below. I'm always looking for more games to play. I'd love to check them out. And let me know if you check out any of these games. Some people have talked about it, doing it last year. I don't know if any people actually did. But if you did, let me know how it went. And of course, a very special thank you to my patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here or get access to patron exclusive videos, or just support the things that I do on this channel, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me. I'm losing my voice here, so we've got to wrap this one up quick. So if you want to see last year's indie recap, you can click up here. And if you want to watch something else, I don't know, I'll decide later. Click here. Bye!